think we're all set up, guys. Hey, what's up? Back again, guys, in the awkward, empty conference room here in Orange Park. Today we're going to start chapter 23, the era of protest. If you haven't yet, went back and copied down the notes off Google Classroom, do that first, pause this, go do that, so that way you're following along as need be, okay? This one's going to be a little bit longer. This chapter is a little bit longer than Vietnam. A lot of things to talk about. It's a really interesting chapter. And it sucks that we can't meet as a whole group because there's a lot of things to get into, a lot of things to talk about, and we just can't do it. If you have any questions, write them down on your notes in your notebook, and make sure we cover it in when we do our Google Meet the next time we meet. There's a lot of things in here that you're going to disagree with. There's a lot of there's a lot of adult things we're going to be talking about. A lot of things that require you to be a little bit more mature, and to things that we're going to basically things that are going to be a little controversial. Okay, things like we're going to talk about abortion in this chapter. We're going to talk about the counterculture. We're going to talk about hippies. We're going to talk about the environment. There's a lot of things that that we might not all agree on. That's cool. That's fine. Remember, I've told you from the get-go that anybody tell you that there's no bias in anything is flat out lying to you. There's always a bias. There's a bias with your teacher. There's a bias in your book. There's a bias on TV. There's bias with everything. Okay? We all have our different situations that we've lived through and different thoughts on everything, and I'm going to let you know where my bias is at when it comes up. And we'll kind of, we'll share them when we come up in Google Meet. Anything you want to disagree with, to talk about, get it off your chest, do it then. Normally we would do it, obviously in the class, but we just can't get there. So let's get to today. The whole chapter is called Chapter 23, Era of Protest. And I got this lovely, lovely human being in the background. This of course, is just a picture of a hippie from the 1960s. And normally we'd go in and ask you guys, how can you tell? And think about that. How can you tell this guy's a hippie? We'll look at his, the fact that he's got this, rainbow, all this colorful bandana, his long hair, the peace sign. There's a lot of things. We're going to get into the first section is all about the counterculture and the hippies of the 1960s. People who grew up in the 1960s, they're like my age parents, probably your grandparents. There's a lot of distinctions, a lot of stuff they did differently that completely went against the culture of the normal culture of America back then. First thing we're going to cover is the characteristics of hippies and this new person, if you will, not a new person, but just kind of this group of people that come up in our culture that's just a little bit different than in the past. So you should have already copied this down. If you haven't copied it down, get it, pause, go copy it, and then come back. Okay, so let's talk about this. What a hippie is. One, a hippie is a person who uses his or her behavior, music, dress, and use of drugs to reject conventional norms. Okay, and we'll put also their values as well. It's a term I've used in the past as well. Okay, so they use their behavior, music, dress, and their use of drugs to reject conventional norms and values. We're going to talk about drugs and their behavior in the following sections here. Okay, this generation is known as the baby boom generation. Okay, way back in the 1950s, it was chapter 19. We talked about basically, young men were coming home from World War II. They were having children, and that we'll get into a little bit of all that. But eventually, we got to the point where we talked about that. At one point, babies were being born. One baby was born every 7 seconds in America. That became known as the baby boom generation. We're going to break down all the generations up to the millennials, and we'll in another slide here later on. Okay. Anyway, so hippies set their lifestyle around three things, okay? Sex, drugs, and music, okay? And again, guys, these are a lot of adult themes. You're young men and women, you're 17, 18 years old. There's things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the sex revolution of the 1960s. and what does that necessarily mean for women and the rest of it. So let's be kind of specific here when we're talking about sex. We're talking about premarital sex, okay? Sex is nothing new, okay? Premarital sex is nothing new, okay? But the fact that like it became okay. Before the 1960s, it was looked down upon. It was not an okay thing. It was something that was hush hush that you didn't talk about. And now we just after the baby boom generation, after the in communes and stuff like that, it became way more acceptable not only to have premarital sex but have multiple partners. We're going to talk about kind of the negative consequences of that and what it led to. Okay, drugs. One of the biggest use of drugs back then, in the 1960s, obviously like weed's always been used in throughout history, but LSD becomes really popular, really, and so acid and mushrooms. Okay, they become very popular as well. Okay, and then lastly, music. What was really kind of popular here was a band called the Beatles. Now that's been on a test before. I don't know if I included that here. Okay, let's just gonna do a little side note on music here, just a little music history, if you will. If you look over here to the left, I wrote down kind of like over the last decades how music has changed in America. Hopefully you can see that. If not, I'll try to pull it over just a little bit so you can see. Here, right there. Okay, so in 1900, we had, country music was a big deal. 1920s, we saw jazz. We already talked about that. 1930s and 40s, we see gospel make like a big comeback. Obviously, in the 1930s and 1940s, what are people dealing with? Well, the 1930s, they're dealing with the Great Depression. In the 1940s, you're talking about World War II. So obviously, like people wanted to get back to, get back to church and get back to religion. In the 1920s, we glossed over that in the Roaring '20s. How things were fast-paced. Definitely music changed. So that's why I put jazz up here. In the 1950s, you had a test question on this on rock and roll and Elvis become really popular in the 1950s. And then we start to see in this generation here, we start to see music change to what we call psychedelic rock. Okay, and some of you guys probably know that if you listen to any like classic rock stations, we're looking at psychedelic rock, art rock in the 1970s, disco, punk rock starts, but it's not really kind of popular until 1990s. Hip hop has started, but it doesn't really kind of get. I don't think it really gets the steam until the 1980s, 1990s. After that, you might be thinking like, what's psychedelic rock? Think of Jimi Hendrix. The old story in his bandana. He's a black guitar player, and he would take trips, of LSD while he's playing. That's why his music all looks like it's kind of like psychedelic. Woodstock was also big in the 1960s as well. Then we get to the 1980s, metal rock. They call it a glamour rock in the history books, but that's more like, I remember, I can look back and see something. I was born in 1985, and you can see like the hair bands, the 80s bands there. 1990s, it changes. You're more alternative. They call it alternative rock, grunge. Rap it really kind of takes hold to today. It's probably like the number one listening to genre today. And then your generation brought about dubstep, which is terrible music. So I'll pull this right back. So just joking about the dubstep, guys. Hopefully nobody listens to that. That is terrible music. All right, so let's get to the last part here. There's one other thing I want to add is what comes from this generation is they call it the generational gap. That what we see is like people who lived through the 1930s and 40s are alive, and they see this group of teenagers that are in high school and college, and the older generations are like, what are you protesting against? What are you really? Why do you have to go against the culture? What is so bad about the culture? We lived through the Great Depression. We lived through World War II. What is it? And there's a big misunderstanding between the two. Okay, this is what we call the generational gap. And I don't know, and this is my biased opinion, I think every generation has that, except for that greatest generation. They didn't really have time to fight back and protest World War II. That wasn't going to happen. There was nothing really to protest because of the Great Depression. They didn't really deal with that. What we've seen in every generation since the 1960s is there's always this, like, young people always go through this, I think. They always like have this like, well, we got to fight back against all the injustices, right? We see it a lot today. We live, up till a couple weeks ago, we lived in the greatest time ever. Period. You know, we have the best technology, the best way of living, you know, and yet we still see all these injustices, especially like people who live in America, and say how like terrible it is. It's the same thing they did. It's this, I don't know, I almost think, it's my biased opinion, I think people are very vain. I think people want to feel special. I think people want to feel like, I'm saving the environment, I'm driving a hybrid. No, you're not. You're not saving the environment by driving a hybrid. It's actually worse for the environment because there's more coal that has to be, they use the electricity to charge your hybrid car up. You just want to feel like you're special. You want to be vain. So I think a lot of people are that way because they want the attention of it, you know. And again, this is my biased opinion. You know, I do think that you can do some things to save the environment, but when people are, I don't know, I feel like the whole injustice thing just bothers me a whole lot. So I'm sure some of you will disagree. That's fine. Please disagree. We can talk about it. Love it. You know, disagreement's what makes America America. All right. So here was the part where I talk about experimental drugs. You can't see that. Let me pull this up just a little bit. The experimentation of drugs. That actually doesn't help at all. All right. So if you don't know that, at the very top says the experimentation of new drugs. You know, this would be the part of time I'd ask the class, like, what do you think is, the most used drug today? You know, what do you think the most used drug is today? I put the decades up here, you know, and what were people, you know, when we really get to like the 1960s, we really see like, drugs and music being like a part of one another. Like we've already talked about 1960s as a psychedelic rock and Jimi Hendrix using LSD. You know, in the 1970s we had art rock, you know. What we started to see is LSD in the 60s, so mushrooms in the 60s, and you had that psychedelic rock. And then in the 1970s, you know, the number one drug use was heroin. Heroin was huge in the 1970s. So you saw art rock, you saw like Pink Floyd, and you know, some of you might not know some of those bands or listen to it. And if you haven't, it's kind of trippy, okay? Then the 80s, what kind of, you know, music? We had more metal rock, more like fast-paced rock. What was the drug of choice in the 80s? Cocaine. Wonder why that was. And then you get to the 1990s with grunge rock and alternative music. Okay? Drug of choice in the 1990s. You know, crystal meth, methamphetamines. Okay, now, what's really kind of weird today is that, like, things have kind of circled back and, you know, we can, I wonder what the number one, you know, what's the drug of choice today? And people tell me it's fentanyl, you know, which is basically synthetic heroin. That more high school students use heroin or fentanyl than any other drug of choice. And you got to understand, like, opioids are part of that. When you talk about oxycodone, Oxycontin, Lortabs, all that stuff's all like synthetic heroins. And when people run out of those pills that they get from their doctors, they get addicted to it and they start to score smack on the streets, whatever it is, it's fentanyl or whatever. Which, by the way, is one of the chief, you know, the Chinese export that a lot to the United States too. One other thing that we got to kind of figure out and fix. All right. So, talked about drugs, hippie commune. So, again, a lot of adult themes here, a lot of things I wish I could talk to you in person about, but we'll go ahead and put it out there. And you know, I've always been honest with you as a teacher. I've always felt that more adults need to be that way with you. And so, you know, so that's why we're talking about drugs, because that's, you know, what you gotta talk about. We talk about the hippies in the 1960s, and we need to talk about sex in the 1960s as well when it comes to hippie communes. What we see since the 1960s in America, we see an exponential growth of sexually transmitted diseases, because really kind of since then. After that big explosion of you know, we'll get to the 1980s and talk about HIV and the rest of that and the rest of those things, the rest of those outbreaks. But what we see on these hippie communes is high drug use and high sexual activity amongst a lot of people. You're not only dealing with premarital sex, you're also talking about, you know, having sex with a lot of people. And you know, it was really kind of, you know, crazy. Communes are still, you know, a thing today. You know, they're mainly out in like California and places like that. It's like what I try to think of, like when I think of like hippie communes, it's like people who don't live in the suburbs, but don't also want to like be like country folk either. You know, they don't want to live on farms and stuff like that. So, but even though it really kind of is. All right, again, if you haven't copied this down, copy it down, pause it, and I'm gonna go straight into it, so I'm just gonna go boom, boom, boom. So Here we go, hippie communes. We see on hippie communes is high drug use, high sexual interactions, okay? That's what a commune is, it's a hippie living community. This leads to increased crime, and it leads to increased disease. Okay, sexual assaults happen almost, I think that they take studies done today on like college campuses today, like 90% of all sexual assaults are because one or both people have been drinking. Alcohol is almost always involved. Hippie communes, drug use is really high, so we see sexual assaults happen a lot, and disease, because there's a lot of unprotected sex going on. Okay, what we also see on these communes is that a lot of former Christians that are like tired of like the same old going to church on Sunday, they get tired of that, and they want to rebel against their parents. They start getting on these communes and they begin practicing new religions, but not new religions. These religions have been around forever. But they start to see all these hippie communes, you see a lot more them worshiping Indian gods. They see like Native American communities and Buddhist gods. Okay, so what else did I want? Let's go. Okay, all right. So that's that. Talk about. I think we got a couple more slides. One more slide to write on, and then a lot of things I just want to kind of talk about. So again. There's another, picture you can kind of see of people living in a commune. You see, barefoot on these communes. It would be very popular for people not to shave, not to cut their hair. For women not to shave too. And you kind of see these guys look like real winners, don't they? But it was really kind of like a really change of what was really kind of normal in America. All right, the baby boom generation. So we're going to talk specifically about these generations and characteristics of them. When we talk about drugs, when I used to ask, what was the number one, used drug in the 1960s? People are weed or marijuana. Yeah, but weed and marijuana has been used forever. It's never been a big deal. It was not a big deal until the 1960s because you had these kids, these teenagers that were loud and obnoxious and just really again, I think they're just really vain. They want to show we can do this, but we're going to fight back. See, we're stoned, and what are you going to do about it? It was always in the books that, really kind of since the 1920s that weed and marijuana has been illegal, but nobody really kind of enforced it. Nobody really kind of budged about it. If you were, smoking pot in your front yard or on your front porch, nobody really budged it. Well, now they are. Since the 1960s, they've been busting that a lot, and I think really that baby boom generation can be blamed for it. So, all right. Why was this generation so radical? I think this is the last long one we got to write on, and then we'll finish section 1. So, why was this generation so radical? Okay, I'm going to break down each generation, and we're going to get to why the baby boom generation, why they were. So, the generation of human beings in America that lived through the Great Depression and World War II, this is known as the greatest generation. Okay. Okay, they survived bad times, and they were very traditional. Okay, so that World War II generation is known as the quote-unquote greatest generation. Okay, the greatest generation, their kids became the silent generation. The silent generation was raised by the World War II generation. They got married, they had kids. They basically, they kept the same traditions as their parents. This generation, the silent generation, eventually becomes the baby boom generation. Eventually their kids become the baby boom generation. Okay? They accepted traditions, parents' traditions. Okay? Now, the baby boomers, okay? They were, again, you see here, self-centered and shallow individuals that were spoiled because they didn't live through tough times. Okay? Tough times breeds tough people, right? People want to, if you want to be tough, you have to live through tough situations. You have to do things that are tough, and that generation, they didn't deal with the Great Depression. They didn't deal with World War II. They're a generation away from it now, so they had no really idea what it's like. And the minute that bad things come up, they rebel again. And the last part here, they're tired of the regular day-to-day suburban lifestyle. Okay. Take a minute there. Now what we're going to do, we're going to break up generations again. I'm going to break them down. We're going to go all the way to millennials, and now I think a few years ago they split off. It used to be like, when I would teach classes, I'd be like, your generation, my generation. And come to find out, like, they really classified all of us as millennials for a long time, and I think they just changed now to where y'all I think are Generation Z or something like that. So, all right, let's go to it. Oof, can't see that. I'll go ahead and pull this all the way down so y'all can see this part. I'll need to write it. All right, so the GI generation, the greatest generation, was born between 1901 and 1924. Okay, most of these people are almost dead now. Like George H.W. Bush, he's passed away now. I believe he's passed away. The silent generation was born from 1925 to 1942. Okay, so they were like little kids when the Great Depression happened, when World War II happened. They really grew up after that. The time that they grew up, when they really experienced things in their teenage years and early 20s, that's what defines you, right? The baby boom generation were born from 1943 to 1960, and there's obviously, like, this is hard to define, and different people agree on different ages and time. Okay, so this is mainly the people who are running the country right now: the Donald Trumps, the Bernie Sanders, the Joe Bidens, the Hillary Clintons. They were born in the baby boom generation. Okay, your parents were probably born in this era right here, Generation X. Both my parents are kind of on the edge here between the boomers and the X's. Okay, I was born in the millennial generation. That's 1982 to 2004. So some of you might be on there. I think most of you guys are on there. I think. Yeah, I think most of you are born in 2002. You're really kind of on the edge there. And then what they call now is like Generation Z, the new generation today. So this is where we talk a little bit about South Park. The irony of the hippies, they've all grown up and they are running the country now. That's the reason why I have $28 trillion worth of debt. It's the reason, these are people making decisions for us right now. The irony is, like, today's youth, if you go look on, watch some South Park episodes and stuff like that, at least, I guess when it was my youth, they make fun of hippies. If you ever really, watch South Park, Eric Cartman's one of the characters on there, and he's really anti-hippie. So, all right, guys, a lot of things we talked about. It was a long lesson. So I'll leave you a couple questions to answer. Again, we're not going to agree on everything, especially when we start talking about more stuff that's like closer to us. There's a lot of things that, there's a lot of bias back and forth, and I've told you, I've always had a bias. Everybody has a bias, and it's awesome to disagree. It's really cool to disagree, and we can kind of go back and forth. Usually we do it in a classroom, but we can do it on Google Meet if you like. Bring it about, talk about it. Appreciate you, and that's that. I'll post the next video in a couple days, okay?